Welcome to this ARK seminar. My name is Siobhan Robinson. I'm Director of ARK, which is the Northern Ireland Social and Political Archive. ARK is a joint initiative between Queen's University Belfast and the University of Ulster, and its aim is open up access to social and political data on Northern Ireland. In doing that, we have a whole range of different activities, mainly web-based resources, and part of our activities each year is to run a seminar series. And today's seminar is on young women in Northern Ireland, key findings in policy and practice implications for qualitative study. And it's been given by a member of the ARK team, Dr. Anne-Marie Gray, from the University of Ulster, who is Policy Director with ARK, and Siobhan McAllister, who is currently working with Queen's at the Centre for Child Healthcare Research, but was formerly with Youth Action, with whom the study was conducted and carried out. The format is that Anne-Marie and Siobhan will present the findings from the study, which will take approximately half an hour, and then we'll have an opportunity for some comments, questions, discussion, observations, or whatever. And I know the people in the audience come from a range of different backgrounds, so we're delighted that you've taken time to join us for this seminar. Following the questions, there'll be a light lunch served outside, and you're welcome to join us for that. You may notice a mic with the camera. We are recording the seminars this year so that we can podcast them, so that people who are unable to attend can actually have the pleasure of seeing and hearing our speakers. And it's actually working very well, so that's what the camera's about. Okay, without any further ado, then I'll ask Siobhan to start the presentation. Thank you.
Just like to begin, obviously, by thanking everybody for coming along today. We know it's a busy time of year for everybody, so we appreciate you coming along to hear a little bit about a piece of research we've been carrying out over the past 2 years or so into the lives and experiences of young women living in Northern Ireland. And this is an action-based research project funded by the Big Lottery and run in partnership with Youth Action Northern Ireland, a large voluntary agency working with and for young people, and the University of Ulster. And we really believe in many ways that we got the funding for this research in light of the recognition of the fact that it was known in a holistic way of the lives of young women in Northern Ireland today. And while we are increasingly hearing about the achievements of young women in particular areas of their lives, such as education and employment, in some ways a relatively poor position of young men in these domains, and in regards to issues related to young men's mental health, has in some ways overshadowed the achievements made by young women, or in some ways also overplayed the difficulties that many young women still face today. So while this isn't about underplaying the achievements and advancements made about young women, or made by young women, it's really about trying to get behind the sound bites and statistics and to reveal a little about the real life experiences of young women today and the persistence of gender inequalities within many areas of their lives. So we're going to focus on a few areas today. Obviously, I want to begin really by giving a bit of background to the research project in terms of the aims of the research, the phases the research went through, and the methodology that it employed. So in relation to the research aims, the overall aim of the project was to carry out research with young women to gain a better understanding of their lives today, and from this to design tailor-made programmes of work to address some of the issues arising from the research. So the research clearly is about action at a very practical level, because it will inform Youth Action's work in terms of the work they do directly with young women through their gender equality unit. So it will inform that work at that kind of really ground level. Beyond this, however, this piece of research is the first piece of research of its kind in Northern Ireland, which looks so in depth at many areas of young women's lives. And we feel that it therefore has great potential to inform practice at a more general level and to input into many policy debates and discussions today. So there were 3 phases to the research. The first 2 phases were based on data collection, and the final phase around running programmes, designing and running programmes and making resources from the research findings. The first phase was the focus group phase, and we carried out focus groups with young women all over Northern Ireland, aged between 16 and 25. And this phase of the research was essentially explorative in nature, with the aim being that these would be carried out in an interactive and engaging manner, in that we would allow the issues to be defined by young women themselves rather than predefined by the research team. So for example, at the beginning of every focus group, we carried out a participatory exercise, like a group exercise where young women would consider the good and not so good things about being a young woman and what they thought might be the good and not so good things about young men. So at this very starting point, the issues were arising from them, and we would probe and allow discussion around that afterwards. As well as this, there was a particular theme attached to each focus group, which ourselves and a group of young women have thought were important to ask young women about. And here again, we would take a particular theme, maybe education, and throw out maybe a few discussion questions at the beginning, and allow the interaction with young women and the discussion that generated from them to define the course of the conversation. So really we were facilitators in many ways. So as I said, this was a very exploratory stage, and an analysis of the data to emerge from the focus groups went on to define the issues and questions on our interview schedule for the second phase of the research. So as I say, very early on, you can see how young women were at the heart of the research, and it was their issues and their viewpoint that was defining it from the very beginning. Well, what we'll be presenting today in terms of findings is really just going to be based on the interview sample. I think it's important just to give a wee bit of background to the focus group sample. So 48 young women took part in the focus groups, and there were 7 groups, and this is made up of two groups of young women in different rural areas throughout Northern Ireland, a group of young women in an urban area, a group in an interface area outside Belfast, a group of young women from Derry or Londonderry, a group attended grammar school, and a group of young women from minority ethnic backgrounds. And as I say, we discussed a separate theme along with the more explorative exercise of each group. So the aim here, and hopefully as you can see, was to get to look at the diverse range of experiences of young women throughout Northern Ireland, so as we weren't really missing anything when we went to construct the interview schedule at a later date. With regards to the interviews, in-depth qualitative interviews were carried out with 43 young women across Northern Ireland, and we also designed a storybook method from the interview schedule in order to allow for the experiences and views of young women with learning disabilities to be expressed as well in the research. And in sample, as I say, this is a breakdown really just of the different age groups of the young women. And although there's slight discrepancies here, we feel that we have a fair representation of the different age groups of young women. I'm not going to go through all the sample characteristics, and obviously a very clear one not up there, which we often talk about in relation to Northern Ireland's religious background. Again, we had a fairly even representation of different religious groups. There were 7 young mothers in the sample, and 7 young women also identified as other than heterosexual. It was very important for us as well to ensure that we weren't just getting a sample of young women who were involved in organised youth activities or community activities, because in many ways Youth Action had a ready-made sample there of young women because of the work they do in our contact with other organisations. But it was important to get the experience of young women who maybe had no interventions in their lives at all, and in some ways to reach those kind of hard-to-reach groups who might be involved in very little. And we feel that we achieved this in that at the time of the interview, 49% of young women were involved with the youth or community group or some form of organised activity, and the other half of the sample had no involvement. Something else maybe I should just say at this point as well, because in relation to some of the findings that Anne-Marie is going to present around family in the home, I think it's very important to say at this point that we didn't deliberately target particular young women for inclusion in the research in terms of targeting young women who had particularly difficult or traumatic life experiences. We did, however, within quite a small sample, come across quite high instances of reported abuse and domestic violence. And it's just to make that point that this wasn't deliberate, and in a somewhat opportunistic sample, in a small sample, it's very revealing that such a high incidence of abuse was coming out. The final phase of research was from the findings that Youth Action would set up and run a number of pilot programmes of work with young women based on themes and issues of importance coming from young women themselves. And to date, 5 of these pilot projects have been run throughout Northern Ireland, and these are currently being evaluated and amended, and they'll be rolled on out to other groups of young women. Phase 3 also involved the design and development of resources for those working with and for young women, and to date within your packs you have one of those resources, and we have another resource here which is literally just being published, and this was created by a group of young women themselves who took the research findings and decided what was important for them and how they could pass that information on to other young women. So you're welcome to have a look at these later. Before really moving on to present findings, I think it's very key for us to reiterate the point about the role of young women within this research, not just as research participants, but the role that young women can play in developing research, in designing it, in collecting the data, and in being involved in the dissemination and the construction of resources from that. Because for us, we feel that the success of this research really very much hinged upon the input of young women in this respect. As well as that, the participation of young women is at the heart of the ethos of the Gender Equality Unit within Youth Action, so it was in keeping with the ethos of the agency. And as well as this, we think there's great potential because of this technique that we use for this research to have a real impact at ground level with young women who are around, who might be going to community centres, and there might be very little gender specific for them, or that they're interested in this resource. It is now available because of that very reason. So just going on from that, with regards to collaborating with young women in the research, a peer researcher was employed in the project for a period of probably about 2.5 years. And the overall aim of that was equipping a young woman with the skills to be involved in research with her peers, to empower her through this experience, and for her to empower other young women through the research. And there's obviously little time to discuss here some of the ethical and practical difficulties of employing peer researchers, and we did have many difficulties, but in the end we did find that with ongoing support, training and supervision and really full integration into the research team, that this was a very rewarding experience for the research team and for the peer researcher as well. And while the peer researcher was involved in all aspects of the research in terms of helping to design the methods of data collection, actually collecting the data through carrying out interviews and focus groups and some level of analysis, her key roles really were to work with a group of young women who would help steer the group, so like a steering group of young women who would be involved in the research the whole way through. And her other primary responsibility was to recruit and to run the programmes that would be developed from the findings of the research. Further to this, as I said, a group of young women from different backgrounds in Northern Ireland were recruited as a kind of steering group, and we call this group our Young Women's Working Group. And this group of young women, as I say, were involved over about a 2 to 2.5 year period, and it was a rolling group. Some young women moved in, some young women moved out. There was a key core group of maybe 3 who stayed with the project the whole way through. And again, they aided in the design of the research, ensuring that it was participatory and engaging. They helped define the issues that we would explore in the themed focus groups. They acted as a pilot group for instruments of data collection. And we would also feed back preliminary findings to them in a more kind of youth-friendly way. And they would feed back to us on what they thought about those. And they would also take those findings away, and in one instance they made a DVD and sent that to the adult steering group of what they thought the most important findings coming out were. And as I say, this was a group of very dedicated young women who put a lot of time aside to be involved in this project. And as I say, these resources are the output from that. And it was clear from our evaluation, because we constantly evaluated that programme as well, that the Young Women's Working Group gained a lot from the experience, not just in terms of personal and social development. They did talk a lot about the confidence that they had built up and the social skills, but also in terms of the knowledge they had acquired and feelings of empowerment. Yet we felt that perhaps we could acknowledge their input in another way as well. So we offered them the opportunity and the support to do a Youth Achievement Award, which basically meant that their input, so they were accredited, they gained an accredited qualification for making this. So as well as the more social and personal skills, that they went away from accredited qualification as well. As well as this, the Young Women's Working Group saw firsthand how their stories, because a number of them were research participants, and other young women's stories could go some way to help and inform other young people in similar positions for them, and they could see what key role they could play in the research process. I just want to read out a wee quote from one of the young women involved in the process, because it was quite illustrative of others. She said, "Being involved in something that might help someone along the line or be useful to them really makes me feel satisfied, and I enjoyed this a lot. Watching the ideas turn into a tangible magazine was an amazing and exciting experience." So the aim here really has been, quite briefly, just to illustrate what a collaborative and participatory approach to research can add to a research project, and to illustrate the various methods that researchers can use in order to ensure that it's not research on young women, but research with young women, and that the ownership of research and findings just doesn't stay in the hand of academics and researchers and policy makers, but that young women who are involved in that research themselves have ownership of those findings too. I'm talking of findings. I'm raised to take a break and bits and pieces.
I think if we had to mention one finding which really stands out across the length of time we've been doing this research, and our final conclusion, it would be, I suppose, quite a depressing conclusion, really pointing to the persistence of very strong gender inequality at structural level, in relation to education, in relation to work, in relation to all kinds of participation, and very deeply ingrained stereotypes about the role of women and the perceived role of men in society as well, from a group of young women aged between 16 and 25. I think linked to that, an acceptance or a perception of the inevitability of this. Certainly they had, I think when we talked to them about work, when we talked to them about education, they had very positive views in terms of what they could achieve, particularly in education, and what the potential that they had in comparison to the potential which their mothers or grandmothers had had. But looking at their stories in depth, there's lots of contradictions in there. And they were saying things like, it's much easier for us to get an education, that's very important, and our mothers would never have had that opportunity, and it means that whenever you get married and you have children, then you can do a part-time job as well as looking after your children. So very, very deeply ingrained gender ideas. But today I'm going to look at 3 of the thematic areas and we looked across a whole range of areas of their lives, including their sex and sexuality, employment experience, conflict, their feelings and ideas about politics in Northern Ireland. But for the moment we're going to look at education and careers, home and family, and some findings in relation to leisure. Just to put education, I suppose, in some kind of context, Siobhan has already referred to how there's been much talk of the educational success of young women. And I think looking back over the past half a century, that's been one of the things which stands out in relation to strides in gender equality, and there's certainly been many gains. But I think we have to accept that the gains which some young women have made have been limited by class and by gender, and levels of attainment particularly are related to those things. And in Northern Ireland, the impact of the secondary grammar school system is an important factor in determining the routes which particular young women take at quite an early age. We asked young women what was the most positive thing for them about either being in school or having been in school, and by far they cited friendships and the social aspects of school as being the most positive thing. In terms of negative things, there was a fairly long list of things, but the things which were mostly mentioned by most participants related to the school environment, the school routine. A significant minority of young women referred to bullying and the lasting impact of bullying and how that hadn't been dealt with. The bullying mostly was indirect bullying, included verbal abuse. There's no doubt that a lot of that hadn't been dealt with very appropriately at the time, and that had left a sort of a lasting impact in terms of their perception of their school life and how happy they had been in school. There were other sort of more traumatic events for them around moving school, particularly I think there was a small number of young women we spoke to who moved from secondary schools to grammar schools in order to do A-levels or to take particular subjects at A-level, and their experience, although it was a very, very small proportion of the sample, was a very common experience in terms of how they felt people perceived them and how difficult that move was. Some of that, I think, we felt were related to class issues. And another group of young women who had particularly, I think, a set of difficulties relating to education were young women who had been in care, either in children's homes or in foster care, and because they had very disrupted home lives, had very disrupted education lives, and had not done well in education and had a poor experience of education as a result of that. We were keen to see if some of the old stereotypes relating to education had been broken down. and we asked about subject choice. I think what we found surprised us in a way, because subject choice seemed from the sample still to be very traditional and to be linked to areas typically associated with areas that women would always have studied in or would work in. And I suppose there's a number of points maybe we'd want to make in relation to this. When we talked to the young women in interviews, they were clear that this was their choice. The subjects they had chosen to do were down to them. I think we do need to look at the nature of those choices in terms of how options were put before them, how well informed they were, how much information maybe they had about how particular subject choices would lead to particular kinds of careers or would restrict them in relation to particular kinds of careers. And we did come across, I think, the kind of thinking that, well, boys are better at certain subjects, science subjects, physics, maths, boys are better at that, and so it's inevitable that more of them are going to do those things. They found some of the divisions in school as natural, and I think some of these quotes sort of illustrate that. Kelly, who's 21 now, said of her school subject choice, home economics was cooking and birds like to cook. She was talking about how there had been no boys in her home economics class in her school, not many boys had done home economics. I suppose this is well after the national curriculum had been introduced, and well after many times people, researchers, policymakers have been saying the subject choice should be broadened out, that gender division should be broken down. And Kim, who talked about helping some of the new subjects introduced into schools, health promotion, social care, into universities. I don't know too many boys who'd be interested in those things. Boys mostly go for the manly jobs, so they were still thinking of jobs in terms of male-female jobs. Those are just two quotations to illustrate, I think, what was a fairly widespread view that women and men are naturally adept at different areas of work or different areas of study. We had a lot of data on education, so really we sort of highlighted some of what we felt were the things that were coming up most frequently. There was a lot of pressure to achieve, and I suppose that comes with women making gains in education, and pressure on young people generally. Pressure from schools, from teachers, with lots of examples of young women saying, our teacher saying to us that this class last year there were so many A stars and that we had to try and do as well as that. And the pressure was not just about getting good GCSEs or grade levels, it was about getting A stars, particularly from people in grammar schools. And that pressure was across the board, from teachers, from peers, and then from they themselves. There's also a tendency, though, for those who didn't do so well, who maybe opted out of school or who felt they had made their own choices, to individualise that failure, not to see it as the result of any kind of inequality in the education system or any kind of failure in terms of careers advice or course advice. It was, some of the phrases that would have been used was I didn't work hard enough, or I made the wrong choice in relation to the course which I've done. There were a group of young women we found who had very, very particular difficulties in relation to education. And I think invariably they tended to be young women who had a lot of pressures outside of school. So those with the greatest difficulty and the most negative experiences, that just wasn't related to what happened in school. They would have been dealing with things like abuse, either child abuse against them or against siblings, domestic violence in the family, parental illness, bereavement, or caring responsibilities. And I think for those young women, what was happening to them outside of school was more important and more pressing than getting exams and doing well in school at that particular stage. Even where there were difficulties, even where people had dropped out of school early, maybe because of pregnancy, even where people felt they had failed academically in school, there was no sense of rejection of education, the opposite in fact. And a number of people who have been in those circumstances made very clear their desire to return to education, because education was linked inextricably with the ability to get a good job and to get good wages, that kind of meritocratic idea that if you work hard there'll be a reward for that. And the idea also that education is more important to women than for men, and in a way that's very stereotypical thinking themselves. You know, the number said, well, boys can go into trades, and trades pay quite well, whereas a woman, if you want to earn a similar salary, then that's about getting a good education and getting a job as a result of that. We did come, I want to make it all sound very negative, because we did come across very good examples of good practice in terms of education. And for some of those young women I've mentioned who had very serious difficulties in school, they had a great experience of informal education or alternative education provision. And one young woman talked about her year in alternative education as being the best year in her entire school life, because she just felt she was much more supported, it was much better suited to her. People were aware of the difficulties that she had and tried to work around those difficulties. We also came across some examples of positive school counselling services and the potential of this. And given that it was very clear that when young women had difficulties outside of the home, certainly affected their education, then for schools to respond to that and to respond to that appropriately is obviously very important. And we felt that some of the things they were saying and what actually resulted in good practice could be taken up and used in some of the new ideas the department has about school counselling. And just to say also that for some young women, they talked about, one young woman actually used the phrase about school being a place of challenge. She was a young woman from an ethnic minority background, and she said that coming here as a teenager, it gave her the opportunity to meet new people, you know, to learn about different cultures, and to help her kind of sense of belonging in that way. And that also applied to people who felt they got more information, more clarity in school if they were struggling with their sexuality or an issue like that. Not much good news in terms of careers advice, which was generally regarded as poor. Only 4 out of the 43 young women that we interviewed said that their careers advice was good. It was worse in grammar schools. I think the attitude tended to be that if you go to grammar school, then we're preparing you for university. And a lot of the young women said that they didn't have any other options put before them, really. Lack of information or discussion about other things. The consequences of that we could see in terms of people maybe who weren't themselves entirely convinced of the value of going to university, or that it was the right thing for them, or of the course that they should do, then dropping out of courses and the impact of that on their confidence and so on. Evidence again in terms of careers advice of being encouraged to conform to gender stereotypes, and I think that is very apparent in relation to choice of training courses, FE courses and vocational training courses, where most young women who did those things were in hospitality, health and social care, hairdressing and beauty, and business administration. We didn't have many examples of really explicit discrimination, but we did have a couple where one young woman wanted to go and work experience in a garage to be a mechanic, and she was really discouraged by the school from doing that, even though she had found a placement that was quite willing to take her. And I think we feel that we want to highlight these findings in terms of policy. The Women in Work Commission reported just this year linking careers advice to persistent gender inequalities in the labour market, and particularly to inequalities, continuing inequalities in relation to pay. And a link to that was when we looked at a lot of the young women in the sample who were studying, were also doing part-time jobs, and those part-time jobs were very gendered in terms of the areas. It's basically the area that adult women were working in, they were working in as part-time workers. There's a lot of discussion around home and families to draw out a couple of those things now. It was clear that for a number of young mothers, the home was a place of security, comfort, stability, and at least if there were difficulties, they still felt there was a safety net there. We found quite a strong connectedness to mothers, particularly from the young mothers in the sample, who felt that they had been taught about how well they had been supported and helped by their own mother. Also, of course, as you'd expect, evidence of financial support, particularly in relation to students in further and higher education. And where immediate family relationships were very difficult, sometimes as a result of abuse, there were still positive stories where grandparents, aunts and uncles had really played a pivotal role in the lives of young people. But as Siobhan said, we didn't seek at all specifically to interview young women who had experienced abuse. but we were really struck by the scale and some of the stories that we heard from quite a small sample of young women, and the impact of that abuse. One impact was the premature experience of independent housing, which resulted from child abuse, where young women could no longer tolerate the situation they were in, or where they had been removed from their family situation, and how that had sort of precipitated them into independent living very early. And the result of that were chaotic housing careers, unplanned, unsupported, and for one young woman, very traumatic consequences was becoming homeless as a result of that. Lack of support when abuse disclosed, although the young women, some of them we were talking to, their abuse had been a number of years previously, that lived with them. The fact that they had told somebody they were being abused and nothing had happened, or at least nothing positive for them had happened as a result of that. So there's a set of issues around how schools respond to abuse, how families respond to abuse, and even in some cases, how social services respond to that. And that's just a quote from one young woman who felt that really it should have been obvious to people that something was wrong with her, and she felt that her teachers knew and they didn't. They chose not to pick up on it either because maybe because they didn't know how to deal with it. But she talked about how she was nervous in school, she was quiet, but people just thought I was strange, and even when I went into school with bruises and so on, nobody still asked her what the problem was. A number of the young women, in terms of consequences, felt a very strong sense of responsibility for siblings, and the way that links to quite the high number of young with caring responsibilities that we find. In a number of cases, siblings remained with parents or step-parents who had abused the young women we talked to, and that was a big source of stress and worry to them, and they made lots of efforts to stay in contact and felt very protective towards siblings. They felt let down, some of them, by family and by teachers, as I said, in relation to schools, but families, a couple of cases also where families had tried to sort of keep the news within the family or swept it under the carpet. And whilst I think it was very interesting that many of them wanted to say to us, but I've dealt with this, and I've come through this and I'm stronger as a result of it now. And that we felt wasn't really the picture. There's much evidence of continuing vulnerability, not wanting to work in workplaces where there was men, very strong statements about what they wouldn't allow to happen to their own children and what families should have done and so on. Continue just the abuse thing, domestic violence. Out of 43, we talked to 6 young women who had experienced domestic violence or who had witnessed domestic violence at very, very close hand. We introduced this topic to them by giving them a statistic about domestic violence in Northern Ireland and asking them, were they surprised by that? And very, very, very few of them were. And they said they were not very surprised because, I know somebody who's abused, or a friend of mine, or my mother was abused, or whatever. But there's also a degree of acceptance, maybe acceptance isn't the right word, but inevitability about the occurrence of domestic violence as well, or at least the inevitability for some people. And one young woman who had been a victim of domestic violence said, I attract them, as my mum says. Or not perceive as something as abuse if you were strong enough to stand up to the person who was abusing you. And this was a particularly poignant quote because she talked about, well, my partner doesn't abuse me, he just pushes me. And she went on to say about when he pushes me, I hit him back. And she was quite a lot of bravado about this. And then she said, didn't put it at the end there because it was getting very long. But she was recommending this sort of as a way that young women ought to be taught to deal with abuse. And then her very last line was, and I hit him sometimes, but he pushes me and I'm scared. So the poignancy was coming through, the fear was there. How they rationalise this in terms of if you just hit back or if you're strong and you respond, then it's okay. How do young women cope? I think Siobhan talked earlier about some of the myths or perceptions maybe. One of these being that young women cope better than young men because they talk. I think we found that coping mechanisms tended to fall into 2 categories. By far the most common was to ignore it, block it out, don't think about it. And that applied to lots of the experiences which people had. They talked about how other young women or other women coped by talking, but then mostly to a young woman they said, but I don't do that. I just think it's better to get on with things, you just have to deal with it. Some did tell us about how they talked to family or friends, but I think they were in a minority. The reluctance to talk may be an admission of vulnerability. If you talk about it, then you have to deal with it. There was certainly a survivor mentality that you can deal with this by getting on with things and by not letting people see that this got you down or that you need to seek help for this. And I think there's just a danger or a concern there that they themselves are believing this myth that women are coping because they talk and it's being dealt with, when you probably really need to look in terms of emotional well-being at what kind of support systems can be put in place for young women. And Siobhan's just going to say a word or two on leisure now.
Very quickly, I'm just going to run through a few of the main findings on leisure. Obviously, as the research was carried out with Youth Action, who are agency which work with people around issues of leisure, it was something very important for them that we look at. So I'm just going to run through some of the main findings. One of the first things we found was it was evidence of young women dropping out of local youth provision and youth clubs around the age of 12 to 14. And this is really interesting but somewhat worrying for us because research done in 1991 in Northern Ireland in relation to the position of young women in youth provision found exactly the same. So 15 years later this trend seems to be continuing and the reasons put forward by the young women now are very similar to the reasons put forward to young women 15 years ago. So this was basically that local provision wasn't gender appropriate or age appropriate. So a lot of young women, for instance, would talk about how local youth clubs were sports focused. The whole focus was on sports. If you weren't interested in sports, the only alternative for young women was to sit about listening to music, watch a DVD or chat amongst themselves. So nothing structured, nothing of much interest for them. And this was across all areas and across different age groups as well. And while there was some acceptance of this by the young women, probably in light of the fact that there was nothing else for them to do outside the home if they didn't go to the local provision, with time this routine became boring to them and they often did drop out. And I just want to highlight a quote made by Jemima, which is similar, really illustrative of other people's experiences. She said, I've went to youth clubs and stuff whenever I was growing up and things like that, but you just never had a big range of activities. It was either football or pool, and I just wasn't one for playing pool. The girls usually just sat and played a board game or something and hang about, you know, I want to go and play a board game on Friday night. It doesn't quite work, does it? So a clear feeling there among young women that, well, okay, fair enough, we'll go along, but it gets to the point where you'll find something better to do on Friday night. And as a consequence of this, a lot of the young women we spoke to have moved their leisure activity onto the streets. And again, this is an interesting find because much of the research on this is focused on young men, and particularly in Northern Ireland, get young men into youth clubs and into structured activities and off the streets. But young women were very much involved in this activity themselves. What we find and what was interesting as well is that the risks that young women reported in terms of involvement in this activity similar to what young men would report in terms of increased risks of being involved in crime and antisocial behaviour and drinking alcohol, and increased risks of victimisation and particularly paramilitary intimidation in some areas as well. Young women were open to that and victims of that as well. But there are also clear risks attached to their gender, attached to being a young woman. So even though a number of these young women would have been involved in this activity in the past, when they looked at young women who were younger today doing it, they were very, very damning of them and would often say things like they're opening themselves up to being attacked or being taken advantage of, and women should know better. So they had very ingrained views around what's acceptable for young men to do and what's acceptable for young women to do, and the stereotypes around that, around getting a name for yourself and how difficult it is for a young woman if she gets a name for herself to get rid of that. Having said that, because of a lack of alternatives, many were involved in this activity. And very briefly, just one of the other key findings within the area of leisure to come out, and this really cut across all of our themes, was the kind of lack of time that young women have in their lives and the multiple realities of their lives. So for example, when we'd ask young women what they do in their free time, they would often pause and say, well, I don't actually have very much free time. And Jill, although she was only 17, again said, work, go to school, do my homework, I don't really have much time for anything else. And that was illustrative across many of the young women's accounts. Obviously particular groups who had more caring responsibilities would feel that they had the less time. And we've referred to this in a way as a leisure squeeze, because in terms of all the other responsibilities and pressures on young women's lives, leisure and time for themselves and free time is the area being squeezed out first. It's that area that out of anything can go. And in some respects, and in relation to what Anne-Marie said, we could use a very similar diagram to this for young women in education. Because particularly those young women who have really heavy caring responsibilities, leisure could go and education could go, because things were just much more pertinent to them at that time. They needed to care for their families and they needed to earn money. So leisure and education were being squeezed out in some respects. And again, I think this is an interesting finding, because there's been a lot of talk about a time squeeze for women in general in terms of balancing a career and a family, but not with regards to young women. This research has very clearly shown that this is starting at a very young age. And research also shows that leisure is very important for emotional and mental well-being, and yet young women aren't having that time. So there's a real challenge there for youth services to think about how we can get young women back into the provision and engage them and work around the other commitments within their lives as well. I'm just going to leave it there.
I'll not stand up again, but just to, we feel the research is being published at a very pertinent time. We're celebrating 30 years of gender or of legislation relating to gender equality. I think what we found is that the issues facing many of these young women are issues facing older young women now, and we would have hoped to have seen some difference over time. That young women would have been saying much more positive things, and that those stereotypes would have been less deeply ingrained. But I think nevertheless, there's challenges here, but there's challenges that can be met. The gender equality strategy is about to be launched next week, and I think there's measures in that which can help to address some of these things. I think there's lots of messages here for different areas of policy making, for education, for health, and for youth services. And as the youth sector is being restructured as part of the RPA, and work is being reviewed, I think we need to look very seriously at work with young women, which has always been a rather neglected part of the youth sector in Northern Ireland, because of the conflict, amongst other factors. And just to pick up on some of these issues, but the research has been very useful, and it's given us a great baseline data to work on for the future as well.
Thank you very much. A fascinating study, and it's very interesting to hear about the approach that was taken. And as you say, I just wish we had time to hear about some of the other themes as well, but I look forward to reading about that and later on, or to hearing about it maybe later on. So I'm going to open up the floor. We have 5 or 10 minutes for some questions and comments, if anyone wants to either pass on your own observations or ask for any clarifications. Feel free to ask.
Can I ask the question, please?
Sure.
Did you do any work on your women's experience of experiencing violence? And I ask this because I work for Amnesty International, which a couple of weeks ago published a survey saying that 42% of young people knew of a girl between 16 and 24 who'd been beaten by boyfriends.
Yes.
Did you find
we did.
like that coming
That's what we were saying, that we had, whenever we were looking at the areas of topics for the individual interviews, we were keen to ask about domestic violence, because research had showed that there's been a real trend in terms of more young women experiencing domestic violence. And we did give them that statistic as a way of promoting that discussion. And we found some really serious cases of domestic violence against young women themselves. But also they told us about knowing people, invariably knew people who had been abused. So there's a knowledge certainly of abuse happening. Some of them had experienced very serious domestic violence. There's very little knowledge, I think, of specialised services. And that would be something that we would be making recommendations around. Very few of them would have known about Women's Aid, for example, or anywhere else they could go to seek specialised advice on domestic violence. And the concern is too, this kind of idea that it is sort of inevitable, and you deal with it. Do you want to add anything?
No, I suppose just of interest in relation to that point is that Women's Aid were running a big campaign as well at the time the interviews were being carried out, so it was even more surprising that so few young women were able, when we asked them, did they know of any specific services, to mention that. And also as well, some young women had a lack of recognition. I think it was actually the young woman that was quoted there about what Women's Aid did. You only go to Women's Aid if you're getting battered about the house, she said. So this very clear view, perhaps a lack of understanding as well about what domestic violence is, like he pushed me but didn't hit me, or emotional abuse coming through in our accounts would not have been defined later on when we asked them specifically about domestic violence, wouldn't come across in their response to that. So there's obviously a lot of education, I think, necessary around those issues.
Yes.
Hi, I'm from the Human Rights Commission, and apologies for coming late. This kind of research will be very useful to our research and policy and legal services team. But I'm just wondering if you were able to make any comparisons with other countries, and I'm particularly struck by the link between the lack of leisure and, of course, general well-being and possibly mental health. And what, just if you were planning to build on this or take this forward in terms of, say, the response to the committee on the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women, which the UK is reporting in January 2008.
Yeah, Miriam, I think the answer to the latter part of your question is yes, that we'd certainly be wanting to build some of these key findings into the alternative report to the CEDAW committee. We haven't made any comparisons with other countries, but we're happy to if somebody wants to give us the money to do that question. And it would be interesting, I think, to look. There was a lot of those young women who were working and paid work whilst they were studying. And whilst we'd have been aware of that in terms of university, but from a very young age, from 14 up, they were doing part-time jobs.
And that was clear. We didn't talk about focus group findings today, but in the focus groups that was clear as well. And the types of work that they were doing, especially in rural areas, the young women were working in shops and the young men were working in garages. So from a very young age, it was clear gender divisions, but it was accepted. It was nothing out of the norm. It was just where they could get a job.
And that was the question I wanted to ask. The continued stereotyping that you picked up, was that something they were aware of themselves, and were they acknowledging that or not? No.
So it was natural. I think there was a lot of evidence that they saw it as natural. And even when they talked, we did ask them about, couldn't talk about today, about work and family as well. And it was just really interesting because they were saying, well, they were setting out the circumstances in which, as a parent, you could work. So if you got a job around the times your children were in school, that was all right to work. Or it was okay if you could, when they were older, then you could do full-time work. But there was no challenge to traditional gender roles within the home. Very, very little challenge to those ideas.
So that principle was a life and time.
Yeah, exactly.
Picked up over the years as well. So I think there's somebody else.
Yeah, in relation to that as well, did you find a difference in the gendering of aspirations and job choice, career choice, and so on between grammar school participants and other participants? And also, was there a difference between rural and urban areas?
Definitely class-based, if we're to look at that as a class divide in terms of grammar sectors, because definitely there would have been differences in the types of jobs they would have accepted or aspired to. And the young woman in grammar schools aspired to, perhaps more than anything, a university degree, but had no idea where to go after that because careers advice stopped at going to university, and when they got their degree they didn't have a clue where to go. Whereas the young women who went straight from school into training or tech were going into lower level kind of service sector or caring sector.
But even in terms of subject choice for those who went on to study, it's still very much gendered,
Yeah, definitely. In terms of rural-urban divisions, we didn't find as many kind of...
No, it splits as we would have maybe have anticipated, actually.
It's interesting in the context of what the CBI, I think it was saying at the recent Equality Commission conference on low pay, that boys and girls are still choosing traditional kinds of subjects that girls are less likely to go into science, and therefore automatically they're in a career path that leads to low pay later on. Perhaps they challenge those gender roles later on when it's perhaps getting a bit late to do so.
I think training is the best example of that. When young women